Our first speaker is Keith Mitchell from DNS OARC, who's going to give us an update of what's happening in the world of DNS. I understand there was a meeting over the weekend and some interesting stuff might have happened.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm Keith Mitchell, President of DNS OARC. What I'm going to do today is basically give you a quick overview, whistle-stop tour through a two-day workshop, which we had on Thursday and Friday in this location. We quite often co-locate our workshops with NANOG. It usually works quite well. And we decided a good way to share from the arcane world of DNS to the wider world of NANOG, what's happening in the DNS world. This is OARC's mission statement. Basically, we are here to help understand the universe of DNS, which is something which is really quite critical to internet operations, research, and abuse prevention. But it's quite often poorly understood. And part of our mission is to try and help bridge that gap and work through knowledge sharing and distribution of clue and best practice to make the DNS work better and to help you as operators run your DNS more effectively. I'm not going to go into our governance model, basically just to say that we're here to do a public benefit mission, and our approach to that is to do it in a way which is compatible with industry best practices. One of the things that we happened to do on Saturday afternoon in the middle of 4 weddings and all the other craziness that was going on in the hotel was to have our AGM. We elected some new board members. I'd like to welcome David Lawrence and Jeremy Tullier as our latest board members. We also passed an AGM, which means that if future board elections, the members will be electing the board members as individuals, which is more in line with organizations like NANOG and many other internet bodies, rather than our current slightly arcane model of electing organizations who then appoint individuals as board members. Anyway, amongst the many things that we do workshops twice a year. These are open workshops. They generally last 1.5 to 2 days. In many ways, they're like NANOG, except that we're not focused in any particular region of the world. It's global, and we have a very tight focus on the domain name system. Our members like us to co-locate with the main internet operations and technical meetings, so we do a rotating co-location with RIPE, NANOG, ICANN, and IETF meetings. OARC 25 co-located with NANOG back in Dallas a year ago, so I'm pleased to see that we're back again. All the information, all the presentations, links to the videos and the slide decks are on the event site website, which is there. And this was actually our biggest event yet. We've had our 2 previous biggest workshops were also in California, but they were co-located with ICANN meetings, whereas now it seems that NANOG is the big place to be. There are many volunteers that make our workshops happen. That includes our program committee, and that's appointed on a calendar year basis. So we're currently looking for volunteers who would like to serve on our program committee for next year. So enough background. What were the hot topics at OARC 27? I suspect that many of you will not have missed the fact that there was supposed to be a rollover of the root DNSSEC key signing key next week, and that's not now happening. A decision was made at the last minute last week to postpone that. So obviously there was quite a lot of discussion about that. There was certainly a common theme about the interaction between providers using DNS, Anycast, content distribution networks, and BGP, and how these all interact for doing and measuring traffic engineering. IPv6 and DNSSEC deployment are just journeys in progress that will never actually be finished. So there's quite a lot of ongoing measurement and ways to fix and make these work better. Abuse prevention, detection, mitigation is a very common theme in everything that OARC does, and there was a number of presentations that focused on that. There are, of course, new protocol features coming down the line, so we got a couple of previews of what's there and what we need to do to make these happen. Also, I'd like to say a little bit about some new software tools that OARC has developed internally. And we didn't have a signing ceremony so much as an unsigning ceremony, so say a little bit more of that as well. So, going back to the root KSK rollover, although the zone signing key for the root has been rolled over many times since the root was originally DNSSEC signed in 2010, the key signing key, the kind of master key that's used to sign their zone signing keys, it's never actually been rolled. And the amount of time since this hasn't been done, various people were getting nervous about. It was decided that this is something that needed to be done in order to demonstrate that it could be done. And there was a fairly extensive plan that ICANN and VeriSign have put together over the past year or two to do this next week on October the 11th. However, this was a process that was being very carefully measured, and there was some late-breaking data suggested, well, maybe this isn't going quite as smoothly as we thought it was. So the decision was taken to postpone the rollover for at least 3 months. What was this new data? There's a new feature in the various DNS implementations, trust anchor signaling, RFC 8145, and Dwayne Wessels was speaking about how he'd been using that data. Getting gathered since this feature deployed suggests that as many as 5% of the resolvers out there, the servers out there are running outdated, statically configured trust anchors. This is not good because the key signing key rollover was basically based on the idea that dynamic trust anchors would be used as part of an automated update process. And also, you would think the people who are running the very latest code, this new feature, would also be people who were carefully looking after their server infrastructure and therefore should be on top of this change. Going ahead with the change with as many as so that's just the people in the know. It doesn't really suggest what's happening about the unwashed masses. There's probably some selection bias there. So the wider world, the problem could be bigger. So the decision was taken to, it was probably safer not to risk breaking things in a visible way. So best course of action seems to be to pause, to gather more data, to try and get some insights. There are other ways to gather data apart from the trust anchor signaling. Certainly OARC's role in this has been to do one of our ditto collections, which we did last week and we were planning to do before the change and we're planning to do after the change. Also Paul Hoffman from ICANN spoke about a recursive resolver testbed that they've built, and they were using that to get better insight. There's probably going to be other data sources as well and other considerations. From an operator point of view, I would strongly recommend look at your trust anchor configuration in your name servers, see whether it's up to date with what ICANN's recommending, and watch this space for further timeline developments. A whole bunch of information on this. ICANN's statement on the decision to postpone last week. Dwayne's presentation, which actually analyzes the 8145 data, Matt from ICANN's presentation, and also discussion of that presentation. We had a special extra session, so there's plenty more information for you there. So moving on from the KSK, couple of presentations about measuring DNSSEC deployment. Scott Rose from NIST has done an analysis of DNSSEC deployment in the .gov domain. That seems to be steady, around 84%, in line with the mandate on federal agencies to use that. SHA-1 and SHA-256 algorithms in use mostly. There were some open questions from his analysis about why certain organizations are changing the salt as frequently as are, and also whether various of the DNS appliances out there are using NSEC3 correctly. Another talk from SIDN measuring DNSSEC deployment is the rootcanary.org project, and what that tries to do is to quantify the quality of DNSSEC validation in the world, e.g. which crypto algorithms are in use, whether they're working or not, how that's working for various servers. As I said, there was quite a theme about here is how we use DNS as part of our traffic engineering and traffic distribution and shaping regime. A couple of talks from LinkedIn. One was a case study about how effectively they use both internal and external CDNs to scale their traffic and also to protect their infrastructure against abuse, including some specific attack cases. And also how they use the DNS tool for traffic steering, which can actually accept big data inputs to decide what answers it's actually delivering. Wes Hardaker from USCIS, they've started using a VerfPlotter tool, and this is an alternative approach to how do you measure the cones of your Anycast deployments. Typically, root operators have been using RIPE Atlas with active measurements for this. This new tool basically does this with passive advantages using IPv4 pings. And there were some quite interesting comparisons to be made between the Atlas measurements and the VerfPlotter measurements. PCH have recently started operating a public benefit Anycast resolver cloud, and they've taken a slightly different approach to telemetry for that using TSDB and Prometheus, so there was quite a lot of detail on how that's working for them. Various talks that tied into the abuse prevention, detection, mitigation theme. The one that I personally found most interesting was one of the European CCTLDs actually went through the exercise of running a live traffic attack against their own infrastructure without giving their staff too much warning to test out all their internal processes. Very insightful and interesting experience. Response rate limiting. Casey Deccio from Brigham Young decided to do a study of who's actually using response rate limiting in their servers as an abuse mitigation technique. Looks like it's around 17%, so there's been fairly extensive deployment of that. Salesforce talked about how they monitor their own infrastructure, again, from a general perspective and also with specific focus on abuse prevention detection. Domain name generation algorithms are something that you may have come across as being used by botnets to create command and control rendezvous points. Interesting talk on techniques for how do you detect a bot from its use of the DNS to actually use these domains. And there was also a plea from Ed Lewis for improving the way that we report and handle abuse and incident reporting within the community. DNS and IPv6 migration. T-Mobile, as I'm sure many of you are aware, have done a lot of work on getting their US customers across to IPv6. So Stefan Lagerholm was basically presenting the various techniques, including DNS64, that they have used for that. It seems like they've achieved something like 89% deployment. There are some corner cases, probably the usual long tail that they will need to work on, but it seems like their approach works okay with happy eyeballs, and that the techniques, they've developed some techniques to detect and mitigate the various causes of failure that can arise for their traffic. We also had a preview of the talk that Jeff Houston gave this morning about how we are not quite in the universe where IPv6 will support DNS if there is no IPv4 out there, and he's identified some issues with fragmentation in MTU size versus EDNS 0 advertised buffer size, which really need to be fixed, and they may actually require protocol transport fixes to be worked around. Evan Hunt from IACI came to talk about Bind. Bind 9 is nearly 20 years old. There's 1 million lines of code in there. And if you apply modern techniques for code complexity analysis, the numbers that come out are quite scary in terms of just how complex some of the critical functions of Bind that are involved in name resolution in particular are. So IACI has been doing analysis work on this. It's also been revisiting some of the performance and platform architecture assumptions that were made over the years, which no longer necessarily apply to modern hardware platforms. And revisiting these, they've been doing various internal projects to break up and move functions and address performance bottlenecks. And there was some presentation of some of the results of that and some of the progress that they've made. A couple of talks looked into caching. Ralph Weber from Nominum has been looking at what they call core domains. Basically, these are the sort of top 100 most popular domains. These account for something like 67% of name server traffic. The top 1,000 account for about 90%. Looks like the overall cache hit rate is around 91% for regular DNS traffic, but if you actually look into DNS traffic, it drops to somewhere around 33%. Daniel Karenberg from RIPE NCC UK root operator also presented a study that they've been doing comparing priming queries that they've been seeing this year versus last year. Not too much change over time, but roughly 2,000 queries a second are seen at KRoot, and 95% of them, it's the same old DNS story, are garbage. Needless to say, most of the junk traffic is generated by a small number of outliers, including one organization that actually turned off caching completely. Daniel basically finished with a plea that we need to find a way to distribute and/or cache the root zone more aggressively. That kind of leads into another talk, which was looking at a couple of approaches for that. There's certainly been recommendations for a while that running root on loopback, running your own copy of the root zone on your own servers might be a good idea, and RFC 7706 actually recommends how to do that. But it's not quite that simple. There are some don't try this at home kids issues if vendors just started shipping this at fault, particularly some failure modes that average sysadmins might not understand. What Peter Spacek from CZNIC did was basically a study where he did some tests comparing the root on loopback 7706 approach against another recommendation, a more recent one, RFC 8189 on aggressive caching, and which is the most effective approach. Do you keep a local copy, or do you try and fill up your copy of the root zone as quickly as possible using aggressive caching? He did this with a testbed. I'm also pleased to say that he used our dual traffic generation tool as part of this. And it appears that 8189, the aggressive caching approach, may have some advantages. There seems to be a much better hit rate in the best case than the worst case. Not everybody in the room agreed, though. There was quite a lot of discussion on that particular point. If there's one thing that's as sure as death and taxes, is that there will be new DNS protocol features coming down from the IETF. Sarah Dickinson from Synodon gave us an overview of work that's being done on DNS privacy, in particular the DNS over TLS standard. So she gave a summary of the various clients that are out there, API, CLI, and mobile-based, and then went into a bit more detail on the stubby client that they are working on and making available. Another thing that's in the pipeline, is the idea of persistent DNS sessions, and this is the idea that you have a TCP session which is open over a long time, and that you're streaming DNS queries and answers between servers and clients, using that, potentially an effective fix mitigation technique for various types of abuse. And there was also a talk from Chris Baker of Oracle about comparing the ways in which CNAME records are used for aliasing resources versus alias records, and how you can actually, if you get too clever with the CNAME chains, you could actually have a significant performance effect, particularly compared to using the new alias records. So that was the presentations from the various submitted talks. We also had some talks where we basically show and tell what's going on in OARC itself. One area where we've had a lot of activity over the past year or two, my colleague Jerry Lindstrom has been working on taking the many, many tools that have accumulated are at and around OARC over the years, consolidating them, and updating our development infrastructure and methodology. You can find a complete list of them at that URL on our website. One notable thing of the past year is that we've taken ownership of a couple of orphan open source projects, DNS Cap and PacketQ. Jerry's also developed a couple of new tools of note. DRO, which was funded by Comcast, at which Comcast are funding us for further development work. Basically, DRO stands for DNS Replay Tool. And the idea is that you can take previous captured packets and change the sequence in which they are replayed, potentially increase the traffic rate to simulate an attack or repeat or loop. It was quite nice to see that there was a number of talks in the workshop of people who have actually found a use for this tool. Jerry was also demonstrating Check My DNS. If you're familiar with IACI's Netalyzer tool, it's kind of like that, but focused on the DNS. But it's not just a nice user interface that you can point your web browser at and find out the state of your DNS resolvers. It's also a framework that we have built behind that, that a lot of the testers that we have accumulated over the years will eventually be incorporated into this common framework, and it'll be easy to add new tests as new DNS protocol features that it's interesting to gather information about arise. All these are open source at the OARC GitHub site, and we've also, Jerry's also put together an automated build and test environment. We had a bunch of lightning talks at the end. The Dorsey DNSSEC algorithm rollover is in the pipeline. A new approach to metazones was discussed. Traffic sources seen at the .nz New Zealand domain. Warren Kamari talked about .internal. This is the idea of having a reserved top-level domain, which is a little bit like RFC 1918 for names. There was also a talk which was somewhat cryptically named RFC 5074 deprecation. One of the things that helped bootstrap DNSSEC back in the day was ISC's DLC lookaside validation service. And the idea was that if you couldn't have a complete signed chain of delegation and authority in the DNSSEC tree that went back to the root, that this would kind of stitch across these gaps. It's 5 years since I stopped working at ISC nearly, and even then we were kind of agonizing of, oh, okay, how do we get rid of this thing? When does it stop being useful? But with many internet operations things, it's like, well, if we turn it off, what'll break? Dan Mahoney bit the bullet and decided that turning it off live on stage would happen, and it did happen, and nothing broke. So I think there's been one or two minor tickets, but in general, you know, the internet house of cards is not collapsed, so the world can do without DLV. You might want to look at your name server configuration though and just make sure that there aren't any dangling DLV references in there. Good tidy up exercise. So until next time, basically all the presentations were webcast on our YouTube channel, and the video archive is available. Most of the OARC team, myself, Jerry, William, and Dinesh are all here until the end of tomorrow. So if there's anything you want to follow up with us about, we'll be happy to help. We haven't quite figured out where our next workshop is going to be. It's going to be in spring 2018. We're hoping that that might be somewhere in the LAC region, but watch this space. In a year's time, we'll be co-locating with RIPE again, and also with the Centre Tech Working Group, and we know that that will be in Amsterdam on these particular dates. But it's always great to co-locate with NANOG. It's always a pleasure to work with the NANOG team. Made life very easy for us in this expensive and interesting venue. So it's been, so thank you to all, both to the PC for letting me speak, and also to Betty and her team for the admin help. Happy to take any questions, you know, if you're interested in becoming an OARC member, then there's, you know, some of the reasons why you might want to consider it. Okay. You know, and the other thing I would say is, if you have detailed questions in the presentations, then please ask the original presenters. I'm not the specialist; they are. Okay, thank you.